Have you started recording already?
Namaskar and a very warm welcome to everyone joined in today on our 57th Know Your Species, Know Your Zoo talk. This talk is being organized by the Central Zoo Authority, New Delhi, as part of the ongoing Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. The Mahotsav is a 75-week-long celebration to commemorate 75 years of India's independence, which falls on the 15th of August 2022. The Central Zoo Authority is taking the celebration forward through a massive outreach campaign entitled Conservation to Coexistence, The People Connect. Under the helm of this campaign, we will be showcasing 75 conservation priority species and 75 zoos, highlighting one species and one zoo each week. We are currently in week 57 of the celebration with the Himalayan Monal as the species in focus and the Nehru Pheasantry as the zoo in focus. So joining today to speak to us on the species in focus is Dr. R. Suresh Kumar, who is a scientist at the Wildlife Institute of India. Dr. Suresh has done his doctorate in wildlife science from again, the Wildlife Institute of India on the olive ridley sea turtles. His primary research interest has been to study the ecology of lesser-known fauna for conservation. He began his research career over 2 decades back with a study on the pheasant distribution in the eastern Himalayan biodiversity hotspot in northeast India. He also discovered a new subspecies of the Slater's Monal pheasant, and over the years, his work has been on varied taxa, which has encompassed different biographic zones of India. He will speak to us today more on the species in focus. So over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Ms. Arundhati. Really appreciate this. And it's also wonderful to be part of this initiative of Caesar Day. And what better than to celebrate our wonderful natural world that we have. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. And so let me share the screen and then I talk. Okay. So are we there?
Yes, that's visible. Please go ahead.
Okay. So yes, so what I'm going to be basically talking about is the Himalayan Monal, which is otherwise known as the mountain peacock. And in my opinion, this is one of the true jewels of the Himalaya that we have. An incredible species, still very poorly known, and it's an identity of many people living in the mountains all across the Himalayan range. So today I will be talking about the Himalayan Monal. And if I would have to share, this is a very personalized story. And while preparing this presentation, I realized that this is the first species that I actually started my research career on. This goes back to 1996, the winter of 1996-97, when I spent some 6 months up in the mountains in Uttarakhand trying to understand the species. So the stories that I will be sharing today is about my personal experiences and also the little bit that we know about the species from literature. So for me, I come from southern India, come from Tamil Nadu, and it's been a long time here in Dehradun. And like I said, I started off my research career looking at this species. So for me, it was more about going to the Himalayas. Uh, Slide is not moving. Yeah, going to the Himalaya, because for me, coming back from Tamil Nadu, in the backdrop of the Western Ghats, I would never see snow. So when I came first to Dehradun, I was totally amazed by the beauty of the Himalayan mountains. And we always knew that the Himalaya is the abode of the gods. And in the gods' country dwell some really incredible species. And one such is the Himalayan Monal. So the Himalayan Monal actually gave me an opportunity to go and explore these high mountain ranges in the Himalayas. And, the Uttarakhand tourism tagline, simply heaven. So there is simply no doubt about it when you especially encounter species like the Himalayan Monal or the musk deer living in such pristine landscapes high up here. This is no less than God's country, or it's truly heaven. So uh, Himalaya snowbound for a long period of time, and species that survive here are adapted to live in these temperate, cold, rugged terrain. And the Himalayan Monal is one such species that live here. We'll talk about it. And so my experiences of the Himalayan, spending time looking for the Monal were basically spent trying to fight the cold winter of Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary. And I used to have situations like this, completely snowbound for 3 to 4 months. So it was quite a bit of a challenge trying to understand the species. So you would still need to venture, whether there is snow or not, you still need to venture out in the open looking for them. So this is one of those images from there. And what better live in a camp with no electricity, uh, biting cold, and still enjoy it. You open the door, it's full of snow, and then you have the Himalayan Monal living in your backyard. In your backyard. So, moving on to the species, that's the Himalayan Monal, scientifically known as Lophophorus impeianus. Lophophorus means lopho, and phorus, this is in Latin, means crest, bearing crest feathers. And impeianus refers to a lady by the name Mary Impian, who was the wife of the Chief Justice of Bengal way back in 1750s. So this particular name is associated with her because she was one of those first few people who kept the Himalayan Monal in her aviary in Kolkata. So that's how the name Imperianas. The Himalayan Monal was otherwise also known as the Imperial Monal or Imperial Pheasant, again referring to that particular person. Now, of course, the name is changed to Himalayan Monal, and it truly depicts what the species is because you find the species distributed all along the Himalayan axis, more than 3,000 kilometers of its distribution range. So, this species is also a spectacular or a natural wonder in the world, one of those few brilliantly colored birds in the world, known for its iridescence. This is otherwise known as bird of 9 colors, and in Nepal, because it is the national bird of Nepal, it's known as Damfe. And there is another bird, just to share with you all, is a monal, but it doesn't refer to the Himalayan monal, but rather they refer it to the tragopan pheasants that is there. So the monals in Nepal are referred as Damfe, meaning bird of 9 colors. And many of you would know that the Himalayan monal is also the state bird of Uttarakhand, from where I'm presenting this talk today. So this has been captured very well by the famous cartoonist Rohan Chakraborty, depicting that almost any color that you name is there on the Himalayan monals. So simply amazing species. So when we talk about the monal, these are also amongst the primitive group of birds. They are, in terms of their evolution or evolutionary origin, they are much, much older than many other species that you would see. So people familiar with birds or bird watching, you would come across this bird in your bird book in the first few pages simply because it's one of those ancient forms. So based on what our understanding of the molecular evolution, we know that the monals or the groups of birds along with the monals, they may have origin somewhere about 10 to 15 million years ago. And so and it's a ground dwelling species. The monal, broadly classified as a pheasant, in which even the red jungle fowl, our domestic chicken, is all part of that family. They are all primarily ground dwelling species, and they have very strong legs, primarily meant for walking or running. And like most other pheasants, the males are the ones which are very beautifully colored, while the females are drabber looking. They're more camouflaged with the environment. And I will talk to you later about why you see these differences in coloration. But a complete opposite is what the females appear as compared to the males. So, was telling you earlier about the Himalayan monal distribution. The Himalayan monal is found all across the Himalayan axis, starting all the way from Afghanistan into Pakistan, then the Indian part of the Himalayas in Jammu and Kashmir, Himachal, Uttarakhand, and then in Nepal, and also in Bhutan, and then extending into the eastern Himalayas of Arunachal Pradesh, and further just nudging or occurring in Myanmar in some parts, and in Yunnan province of southern China. Parts of Tibet that's adjoining to the Himalayan range is also where the Himalayan Monal occurs. So if you look at this, this is a very wide distribution range. This is a map that I had made from the IUCN Red List. Though it is shown like it is distributed well across the Himalayas, but on the ground, I believe that this may not truly be the case. The populations, at least, would be patchy in nature. They would be there all through, but very likely that they occur in patches. So this particular species, given its current population status and also and also its distribution, wide distribution, it is classified as least concerns, not something that we need to worry about. But though the population is decreasing at site level, people do see quite a bit of change in the population of these species. The Himalayan monal is truly a species of the higher elevations, occurring all the way up to 4,500 meters. So this is a species, I would say, a specialist of the alpine zone, though they would occur from the temperate forest, then into the subalpine and the alpine zone. Another thing that I would like to add here is that as you proceed towards the east or the eastern Himalayas, that is, once you cross across from Bhutan and then to Arunachal, the species generally becomes very rare. And that is where you have the other species known as the other sister species known as the Slater's Monal. The area marked here in blue is where the Slater's Monal occurs. And this area marked in red here is where both the Slater's Monal and the Himalayan Monal were originally thought to overlap. So there is historical information that says that it is to be confirmed, but it's likely that both the Himalayan Monal and the Slater's Monal meet, and this is possibly the area where they segregate themselves from one another. But subsequent surveys, I'm talking about surveys undertaken in the 50s, 1950s, subsequent surveys in bird collection expeditions in some of the remoter parts of then what was known as Northeast Frontier Agency, it was found that the Himalayan monal suddenly appears in a few sites here, and then thereafter it disappears, then again appears there. So what to me it appears is that the Himalayan monal distribution, for some reason, beyond Tawang district in Arunachal Pradesh, it becomes rare and it's actually absent in some places only to reappear again. Now, interestingly, in the area where both the Himalayan and the Slater's Monal were thought to meet, you don't have the Slater's Monal and you also don't have the Himalayan Monal. And that particular region, a narrow, a small distribution range, is actually occupied by the white-tailed Monal. And this bird is very closely related to the Slater's Monal, except that the tail coloration is all white. Now, just for your information, there is one another species that is found beyond the Indian region that is known as the Chinese Monal. It's basically in the Qinghai Plateau and the Sichuan province of China. That's where the Chinese Monal occurs, much larger in body size. If you compare body size, the Chinese Monal is first, then the Slater's Monal and whitetail Monal, then the last is the Himalayan Monal, which is the smallest amongst the monals that we know. So, and one important thing that you would also notice in all of these three monal pheasants, or the Chinese, Himalayan, and Slater's Monal, is the coloration of the tail. Of course, there is also the absence of the crest feathers, or it is shaped differently. In this case, it's a crown and not a crest, but whereas here it is a crest, the Chinese does have a crest. So what you notice is that a noticeable difference is that of the tail color length. So you would be curious, why is that the tail color is changing as you move across the Himalayan range, and then it is also being replaced by one other species. So we'll talk about that a little later. It definitely has something to do with the females choosing for that particular tail color, or rather, we are talking about sexual selection at play here, than possibly natural selection setting in, bringing about the changes in these white feathers. So, like I had mentioned earlier, the Himalayan monal is a species of the higher elevations of the Himalayas, and possibly one of the highest elevation occurring species in the world, given that the Himalayas are the highest mountain chains in the world. So, all the way from 4,500 meters, where you would see patches of forest and alpine meadows and alpine scrub like the rhododendron, is what you primarily see, where you primarily find the species. Now, you also know that the Himalayas is distributed along an east-west axis. The northern slopes of the Himalayas are generally drier because much of the monsoonal clouds are blocked by the southern slopes. And the southern slopes is also where you have the broadleaf forest, or it's more densely vegetated or forested. So this is a species that associates itself with the so-called wetter parts of the Himalayas, more to the southern slopes of the Himalayas. So this is one of the higher elevations. You have here alpine scrub, very broken terrain, lots of cliff faces that you will notice. There is also a lot of rock cover. So this is typically what a Himalayan monal would generally occur in. This is again images of that, but you can notice that in some of the interior, remoter parts of the Himalayas, the area is really inaccessible, and there's very dense temperate forests. And so during winter, they would descend down into these forests, and some rare occasions they would move down as far down as 2,500 to 2,000 meters, but they would invariably try to stick around in the elevations that they are primarily comfortable in, which I will talk to you about later. Having told you about that, their prime area of occurrence, the species is also thought to show altitudinal movements, given the severity of the winter conditions, when there would be much of the monal habitat would be blanketed with 4 to 5 feet of snow, and it will be impossible for a ground dwelling species that survives on ground vegetation or tubers that it would feed on to dig through that deep amount of snow. So they would definitely be pushed down to lower elevations. So in literature, there is mention of the Himalayan monal moving down to lower areas, but it also depends on the aspect and also the gradient or the slope. If in an area, if it is all generally south facing slopes, and there is all interspersed with cliff faces, and that the gradient is very steep, the monal would get definitely a lot of exposed patches in those areas, and they would go looking for their food. So this is something that is known, that they would do shift down to a lower elevation, but not necessarily everywhere and not necessarily all populations. So having said this, during my time in the Himalayas in Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary, I would often see that the monals, a few of them, especially the males, sticking on really in the higher elevation, so around 3,400, 3,300 meter elevations, where there would be patches of open ground just simply because of a rock outcrop or something like that. You would see the monal hanging down there. It would fly down to the forest, but often would again return back to those areas, suggesting that some monals in males, possibly the dominant individuals, may not move at all. Now, the females, what I definitely noticed was that they do move down. But when they do move down in the autumn months, in the month of October, November, when the autumn season sets in, they also flock together. They gang up. They gang up in very large numbers and remain more to the forested habitat. Now you can understand, when large bodied birds like the Himalayan monal, which would weigh close to about 2.5 to 3 kgs, when they would be in large numbers, they are easily visible to predators. So chances of predation goes up. So I suspect that once they flock together, they take benefit of the vegetation cover or the forest cover. So moving around in the lower elevations, they definitely move down. So I had also talked about the flocking behavior, but I would like to add a little bit to it. There were some interesting things that's mentioned in literature as well as what I observed. There were always solitary individuals through the year that you observe, solitary males that would stay around, which appears like a brilliantly colored bird like this would hold on to territories which are, very key critical nesting habitats or so-called habitats that the females would prefer to use. And so all through winter, they would probably guard these areas by holding on to those territories. Now, so they generally occur solitary. Now, there would be also cases where males would move down with the females, and so along with the large female flock, you would also see one male accompanying them or one or two males accompanying them. So either the male and female would occur as a pair, or they would be interspersed with that entire flock moving together. But another interesting observation is that during winter, peak winter, when there is peak snow in the area, all the males in the area gang up together. They form something like a bachelor flock where they would forage together, they would move around together. This is not a flocking behavior that you would observe for a very long period of time. But during that peak snowfall period, when there has been a fresh snowfall over last 3 to 4 days, then you would see this flocking together, and then they would disperse off after maybe a week or so, or maybe a little bit more. Now, just imagine, just you can visualize how brilliant it would appear, the Himalayan Monal with a backdrop of snow. And you have 11 to 13 Monals that I had personally seen moving around together, foraging together, and sometimes do also try to chase one another. So this is simply incredible. And, you are truly in God's country when you have sightings of such a kind. So monals primarily forage on ground. I have never observed them foraging up on the tree or something where they would try to at times pick on the moss or something like that. So invariably, most of the time, they are on the ground and digging. They are expert diggers. And what I had often noticed is that they seem to know certain sites. This is during winter. They seem to know certain sites where they need to dig. And what exactly are they digging? They are digging for tubers. So, if you would call this bird as a specialist in terms of its diet, then definitely this is a tuber feeder. It feeds exclusively on tubers. I will show you some of the food plants that they feed on. But for quite some time, if a monal knows that there is something that it is looking for, it would continue to keep digging with its very large beak, and then scrape the ground with its feet like a chicken. But beak is very, very important. So if you may have noticed, some of you may have noticed in zoos, or the zookeepers would know, if an aviary where the Himalayan monal is exhibited, and if the surface of the ground there in the aviary is hard, their beaks would tend to outgrow, and they would grow so long that they would not be able to feed. So, allowing the Himalayan monal to dig, or the digging is part of its lifestyle. If it doesn't get to dig, then it's not at home. It doesn't feel comfortable at all. So they're primarily tuber feeders, whether males or females, they're digging for it. And I've often noticed that the males would return back again and again to the same spot in winter. So why winter? Why I'm stressing on this fact? All of that food that the monal feeds on is actually below ground vegetation, below ground biomass or tubers. And the above ground vegetation of those particular plants are all in a senescent state. They would have all decayed for the winter. They are not live, but the tubers are live. So how does the monal know where exactly those tubers are? Is something that is always a curiosity for me. I've always wondered, how do they know that? Invariably, where a monal was digging, if I would go there and it gets flushed, I go there and dig a little bit more, I would end up finding what the tuber that the monal was actually looking for. So these are some of those alpine plants, that tubers of which that they feed on. This is a cotoneaster species, a small scrub, I would say, the fruits of which they feed on. But primarily they feed on this particular species known as Dactylorhiza hatagiria, which is a ground orchid, and locally it is known as Hath Panja. because the tuber actually it's 5 tubers joined together and appears like a hand. That's why the name Hat Panja. And this is one of the very important medicinal plants. So there is a lot of medicinal, there's a lot of collection of this particular plant. So is the case with a few others. This is Taraxacum, this is Roscoia, this is Satyrium nepalensis. Again, these three species are ground orchids that Himalayan monal feeds on. So uh, some of the alpine areas, especially when we talk about threats, the alpine pastures which are heavily degraded and you do not find these food plants, the monal populations are likely to be very suppressed. So moving on to the courtship display, about the species is very well known for it, and it's a spectacle. How many other times you would see it, you would not be satisfied. You would want to see it over and over again, that these birds are able to do such a incredible display. So the Himalayan monal, the males have developed this highly iridescent plumage, possibly as a result of uh, very high sexual selection, or females selecting only those males showing these plumage and incredible plumage. So gradually over time, they had started to develop these incredible iridescence coloration. So the courtship displays are of two types. The photo depicts here of a display of the monal when it is in flight. So during the courtship period, a Himalayan monal sitting out on a cliff on a ledge would often take flight, would fly out into the air, and these are heavy-bodied birds, so they cannot fly like just like any other bird, but their flight would be a swift beat of its wings, and they would glide down and then gradually do a semicircular flight, returning back to another part of the cliff face. And in the process, during display, in the process, what the monal would do, once it has gained much of its flight and when it is now going to switch to a gliding flight, it would hold up its wings in a V formation. And the tail would be fanned out, showing the white on the rump or the back more clearly, more prominently. So they do this. They would also, bank or flank, as they glide, possibly females moving around on the cliff slope, for them to see how beautiful my plumage is. In my understanding, this kind of flights are also adopted by some males to show to their competitors, hey, look here, I'm here, see how beautiful feathers that I have. So this is one of the displays that you would see. Now they do flush down, and they may not show this flight, especially when there is a predator or they're escaping from a predator. Then it is a very swift beat of its wings, and they would fly down straight into the forest or into the scrub, only later to come back. Now they often try not to fly down too much because they cannot fly back up. So they would have to climb back or run up the slope all again to come right to the area from where they had let off. So the courtship display flight is quite different. It is often in a semicircular flight, only to see that the bird would again return back, the monal would again return back to the same place from where it had took off. Now, the other display that everyone is very familiar with, or most people are familiar with, is the display that they do when they're on the ground. And like the Indian peafowl, where the tail feathers come into play, where the tail feathers are fanned out. Likewise, the Himalayan monal would fan out its tail feathers. So this is where the tail feathers come of use, and they would also, display the feathers almost like like the peafowl, like the common the Indian blue peafowl. So, which is why people relate to this particular species as a mountain peacock, almost blue like the peafowl, and also uses its tail feathers to fan itself. Now, when they do fan their tail feathers, there are certain aspects that you would also notice, that if you observe very carefully, the crest feathers will become very erect, When it is not displaying, they would usually be hanging on the back of the head. But when they are displaying, they would make it erect, and the feathers would come in the front, and it would start, shivering the feathers. The wings would droop down a little bit, and it will start shivering its wings. So it's known as a wing shiver behavior. And the bird will start to duck, and the tail feathers are now fanning out. And if the female is really, really close, then the tail feathers are fanned up, held up like this, and they would flap it. And in the process, they would turn back, they would show their back to show the white patch. But more importantly, on these blue wing feathers, you will notice that there are still few other metallic sheen, a very different kind of a blue feather that is there in that. In my observations, it is that particular feather that they are using to attract the female. So I think that the females are perceiving these colorations in a very different manner, or the males are trying to form some kind of a pattern to basically express the quality of the male, or basically at the end of the day to say that, look, how fit I am and how beautiful my feathers are. That would mean that I'm really fit. I'm free of any parasites or any of that. So the females possibly choose the males based on those colorations. So here is a video that I would like to share. This video is slightly poor in quality, but you would notice as the video is played, I will also tell you to notice certain aspects of it. Now the bird is fanning its feather. Every time it fans its feather, you will notice a blue flash here, blue flash here again. The feathers, the crest feathers are erect. And there, these blue feathers. Tail is fanned. There is one another video that I would like to share here. Sorry, just hold on a minute, please. Oops, I'm sorry for that.
So is it all right? Would you like me to share, or is there anything?
I think I'm almost done. Yeah.
Okay, fine.
There it is. Sorry for that.
No problem.
This particular video is quite heavy, so it's taking time to load on. Yes. Come on. Oops. Yeah. This is another video to basically show you this is actually the video is credited to Mr. K.S. Sajwan, who had posted this on YouTube. You can go back and have a look at it. Yeah. That would be simply incredible, I guess. And this is one of the very few birds in the world that has such a spectacular display. And in fact, as I speak to you now, in April of 1997, I was sitting up in some of these sites, and I would actually see a few males displaying, 2 or 3 males displaying to one another. They would hold on to 1 or 2 rock outcrops, not exactly at this place, but slightly lower where there is a cliff face, because much of these areas used to be snowbound in the month of April. So I feel quite nostalgic actually watching the Himalayan Monal display, because it takes me back in time. Now, post the so much of the display is taking place as the snow starts to melt and the snow starts to recede. So what we are talking about basically is from middle of April onwards and all through, say, the first 2 weeks of May. Thereafter, and so as the males start to display, the females are also gradually moving up into the alpine scrub from their from the temperate forested habitat. And the males would display very intensively during this period. So post nesting, it appears that the females would pair up with with a few males, but in our understanding, it is still not very clear. But what it appears is that they possibly have a lekking system. A lekking system is something like an arena or a display ground where 2 or 3 males would display, and the females would walk up to them, look at them, and okay, choose to or decide, okay, I will mate with this guy, go mate with them. So during this display and mating process, one male may possibly mate with several females. Now, this is a lekking system. This is also seen in other species like the Great Indian Bustard is one of the examples. The black buck, again, a species of the open dry grassland, another example that I can think of. So our understanding of this is still very poor. We still don't know much about it, but this is something that is likely to be happening. Now, having said that, whether they pair up for that season, or whether they pair for life, or whether they have a more fluid relationship is again something that we don't know. But what is suspected is that a male may maintain a harem of females. Like in the case of the red jungle fowl, usually a male is accompanied by 3, 4 females, or the male may be, mating with, may have a polygamous. The Himalayan monal may have a polygamous mating system. So, post mating, the females choose to move into the alpine scrub. They take benefit of these rock outcrops. There would be some shaded overhang. They may choose to nest below that or just below this grass clump. This is a particular species known as a tussock grass, very typical of the alpine areas in the western and central Himalaya, and this is known as Denthonia kashmiriana. During winter and then early summer, the grass is usually yellow or golden yellow or dry. But as the monsoon arrives or as the rainfall arrives, they turn green. So the Himalayan monal females would choose to nest in that. So what appears is that given that the males are so brightly colored and so visible to the predators, it appears that males may not actually participate in incubation and parental care. The clutch size is usually 4 to 5, could be even less, but on an average 4 to 5 eggs. The female monal appear to primarily take on the role of incubation and rearing chicks. The males may accompany them, but always at a distance. And it appears to me that the males, given a situation of predation risk, they would try to distract the predators by actually showing themselves up and taking the predator away from where the females are there with the eggs or with the young chicks. So this again something that we really don't understand. Now the young birds, particularly the young males, they appear like the females. Like in most other galliformes birds, they appear like the females for the first year, but from the second year onwards they start to molt and start to show the male plumage. You can make out young males which appear like females by a black patch on their throat. In the adult female, it is generally white. So there are certain features by which you can make out that this is going to be a male or this is a young male. So in this species, primarily it is the role of the females, and now you can understand why she's so highly camouflaged, completely merges with the backdrop of the grass or the grass blades. So I got a chance to encounter one such female incubating. She was sitting on her eggs and covered under the Dantonia grass. And I could really approach her close. It was by accident. I didn't know she was there, but it was by accident. And then she just stayed on. She didn't fly out from there. Once she left the nest, I noticed there were 5 eggs in that clutch. So I mentioned to you earlier 4, 5. Literature generally talks about the nesting area of the monal to be a scrape on the ground, or there is not much bedding or nesting material. But here it appears that they actually had used the dry blades of the grass to form a kind of a small cushiony platform on which they lay the eggs. So the chicks arrive just when the monsoon arrives. So by middle of June, they start to have chicks, and this is the time when they possibly also forage on some insects to meet the protein requirements for the chicks to grow much faster. But otherwise, they are generally feeding on tubers and fruits and plants that they are possibly feeding on. So in a snippet, this is what I could tell you about the Himalayan Monal. And to last, to almost end my slide, touching on the facts of threats, though I had started off with the presentation saying that this is a least concern species, but unfortunately that may not be the case when you look at it at site level or site scale. So there is extensive livestock grazing in these alpine pastures, so there is a lot of competition. How populations of Himalayan monals are actually affected by livestock grazing is something that we don't understand. Of course, the livestock grazing is primarily on the above ground vegetation, but that the tubers are dependent on that short window of time when they can actually grow and proliferate. So definitely livestock grazing is having a major impact. Medicinal plant collection is quite serious, given that I told you there are some of these food plants that these birds are really dependent on. Tourism related disturbances at select sites has become a big problem. There's a lot of hiking in some areas. There is unregulated touristy activities in some key sites for the Himalayan Monal. In fact, the area where I had done my study 25 years back now has extensive tourist infrastructure all year, even through the winter. There is a lot of people living in those areas who are dependent on firewood to keep themselves warm. And there is also naturally the issue of disturbance. And of course, there is something that we still don't know, the undocumented part of it or the unspoken part of it, which is the hunting related issues. In the Western Himalayas, it has come down over the years, but there would still be some amount of hunting that is taking place. The species is more threatened due to hunting in the Eastern Himalayas, from Arunachal onwards, further into southern China. So overall, in all of those remote regions of the Himalayas, very likely that the Himalayan monal population still survives, still have a good stronghold. But in many other parts, this is something that is something that is a cause for worry. The populations are also on the decline. How climate change impacts are shaping the distribution range of these species is again something that we do not understand. It can be a good subject for study to understand this particular aspect. This is my last slide. Thank you for listening. This used to be my camp called the Shokarak, which locally amongst the people, this is known as the Camp of Silence, because this is the area where the spirits live. So I had the opportunity of living in such a place, very pristine landscape with the monals, and that memory still stays very, very strong. And I think all through my remaining part of my life, that's going to stay strong. So please go look out for the Himalayan monal, such an incredible species that we all should be proud of. So thank you so much, Arundhati, for this time. I think I might have overshot my time quite a bit. I'm sorry about that. I get quite emotional when I talk about the species. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for giving an overview of the species, its biology, and along with videos. Thank you so much for that. We will take question answers for this session at the end. So we now move on to our Know Your Zoo talk, which is with for which we have with us Mr. Chaman Lal, who is the Range Forest Officer of the Nehru Pheasantry. So Mr. Chaman has done his undergraduation in forestry and has since joined the Himachal Pradesh Forest Department. He has worked in different capacities with the department and is presently overlooking the management at the zoo and the wildlife department. He will to us today more on the zoo and focus. So over to you, sir. Please start your
थैंक यू मैम। सबसे पहले मैं डॉक्टर साहब का धन्यवाद करना चाहूँगा कि इन्होंने जो हिमालयन मनाल पर उसका जो फ्लॉकिंग बिहेवियर, मोर्फोलॉजी, हैबिटेट, डाइट, उसका जो डाइटरी हैबिट कैसा है उस पर इतना विस्तार से बता दिया है कि शायद हमें भी इतना मालूम नहीं था जितना उन्होंने बताया। और जहाँ तक एम आई ऑडिबल मैम? हेलो?
Yes, sir, you're on.
जी, जहाँ तक बात हम फिजेंट्री की करेंगे, क्योंकि नेचुरल एनवायरनमेंट या उसका नेचुरल हैबिटेट के बारे में तो बहुत डिटेल से सर ने बता दिया है। तो फिजेंट्री की बात करेंगे मैम, नेहरू फिजेंट्री की। नेहरू फिजेंट्री जो एस्टेब्लिश हुई थी 1984 में एस्टेब्लिश हुई थी शुरू में। तो इसमें बेसिकली रेस्क्यू सेंटर के नाम से हुई थी, जिसमें कि जो मैनेजमेंट हम फील्ड स्टाफ करते हैं, सबसे जो हमारे इंचार्ज रहते हैं, डिविजनल फॉरेस्ट अफसर है, उसके नीचे कंजर्वेटर, असिस्टेंट कंजर्वेटर ऑफ फॉरेस्ट है, रेंज फॉरेस्ट अफसर है, डिप्टी रेंजर्स है, फॉरेस्ट गार्ड है और बर्ड और एनिमल अटेंडेंट। ठीक है जी। ये जो फिजेंट्री हमारी रिजर्व फॉरेस्ट दाना बिहार में है, जो कि 0.05 हेक्टेयर में फैला हुआ है और मनाली हडिम्बा रोड पर सिर्फ 100 मीटर की दूरी पर है मैम, बिल्कुल हैबिटेशन के नजदीक। टूरिज्म इन्फ्लक्स बहुत ज्यादा है और रिकॉग्नाइजेशन इसकी सेंट्रल जो अथॉरिटी से ही हुई है। रेस्क्यू सेंटर के नाम से इसको बनाया गया था, जो कि बाद में फिजेंट्री करके नॉमिनेट हुआ। इसके दो पार्ट है, डिस्प्ले एनक्लोजर्स है और रेस्क्यू एनक्लोजर है। इसके अलावा कंजर्वेशन ब्रीडिंग सेंटर है, लेकिन हम बहुत जल्दी में बात करेंगे मैम इसके ऑब्जेक्टिव्स की। ऑब्जेक्टिव्स इसका अवेयरनेस और नेचर, वाइल्ड लाइफ कंजर्वेशन है, रिक्रिएशन एंड नॉलेज ऑफ वाइल्ड लाइफ थ्रू स्टडी ऑफ एनिमल बिहेवियर। ऑब्जेक्टिव थे इसके exhibit the wild animal in environment as close to possible to their natural one, with the opportunity to visit, also to visit them in similar natural condition। प्रेजेंट्री के साथ ही हमारी मनाली टाउन के साथ ही कोई 1 किलोमीटर दूरी पर ही हमारी मनाली वाइल्ड लाइफ सेंचुरी भी शुरू होती है। जितने भी बर्ड जो हिमालय मनाल रेस्क्यू सेंटर में आते हैं वो मैक्सिमम इसी एरिया से आते हैं। इसके कई तरह का हम बाद में डिस्कस करेंगे मैडम। ये हमारे 7 एनक्लोजर है जो प्रेजेंट्री में है, जिसमें कि 14 स्पीशीज रखी गई है। मेनली इसमें पी फॉल भी आ गया है, बल्कि पी फॉल का हैबिटेट नहीं है ना इसका जोन है, फिर भी एक रेस्क्यू होके आ गया था। चीर फिजेंट है, ये भी पेयर में है। कलीज फिजेंट हमारे पास अबंडेंट है फिजेंट्री में। टोटल रेस्क्यू है इसमें से 50% रेस्क्यू और फिर उसके बाद ब्रीडिंग से आ गया। मोनाल हमारे पास हिमालय मोनाल 13 इसमें मेल है, 1 फीमेल है, 4 जुवेनाइल है। बाहर हेडेड गुज आ गई एक रेस्क्यू होके। ब्लैक काइट है और फ्रैंकोलिन है, चकोर, हिल पार्ट्रिज, गेटवाल वाटर बर्ड भी है, कॉमन टील है, गरगनी, कोकलास और एक गुनियाफेल का पेयर है। ठीक है मैम। और ये सारा जो है ये सब जो डिस्प्ले एनक्लोजर में ही रखे है ये स्पीशीज सारी। और ये जो फोटोज आप देख रहे हैं ये हमारी फिजेंट्री के ही है। ये सारा एनक्लोजर्स है, वाटर पॉन्ड बनाया है। ये फिजेंट्री जो बिल्कुल थिक फॉरेस्ट है देवदार का, बिल्कुल टाउन के साथ उसी के बीच में है। और ये जो एनक्लोजर है ये रेस्क्यू एनक्लोजर है। इसमें जितने भी हमारे रेस्क्यू होके एनिमल आते हैं उनको स्ट्रेस में रहते हैं, तो उसको थोड़ा स्ट्रेस से दूर करने के लिए इसको इन इन एनक्लोजर में रखते हैं। सिर्फ एक ही एनक्लोजर है। उसके बाद जैसे थोड़ा स्ट्रेस से दूर होते हैं तो हम फिर उनको डिस्प्ले केजेस में डालते हैं। ये गुनिया फॉल का पेड़ है जी। ये मनाल हमारे रेस्क्यू सेंटर में ही है और कॉमन टील। जो मैन पावर की जो बात हो रही थी, डीएफओ साहब जो है श्री राकेश कुमार जी है, हमारे रेंज पर अफसर है, एक ब्लॉक अफसर फर्स्ट गार्ड। ये सैंक्शन पोस्ट है मैम। जो सैंक्शन पोस्ट नहीं है, जो हमारे जो बिल्कुल ग्राउंड लेवल में काम सेंट्री में करते हैं वो फर्स्ट वर्कर कर रहे हैं। और श्री मान सिंह जी और श्रीमती अनीता देवी है। सैंक्शन पोस्ट इनकी नहीं है हमारे सेंट्री में, सैंक्शन सिर्फ फर्स्ट गार्ड तक ही है। जो विजिटर और जो इनकम हमारे नेहरू फिजेंट्री से होती है वो 2019-20 में 6,91,000 के आसपास थी, पर कोविड-19 की वजह से 2020-21 में ये घटकर 1,29,000 के आसपास रहेगी, और इस वर्ष 21 और 22 में ये 4,70,000 के आसपास रहेगी मैम। तो जो एंट्री फीस हम फिजेंट्री की लेते हैं वो चिल्ड्रन के लिए तो फ्री है, लेकिन एडल्ट के लिए 20 रुपीज है। स्टाफ मैनेजमेंट में हम स्टाफ और फिजेंट्स का एनुअल हेल्थ चेकअप भी कराते हैं। डीवॉर्मिंग शेड्यूल हमारे बने हुए जी, क्वार्टरली डीवॉर्मिंग होती है, और जू हैंडलिंग पर ट्रेनिंग हम करवाते हैं। गोपालपुर जू जो हिमाचल में ही है वहां भी जाते हैं, हैदराबाद ट्रेनिंग हुई है। उसके अलावा हम स्टाफ को एक्सपोजर विजिट करते हैं, ट्रैंकुलाइज करने की ट्रेनिंग वगैरह जो देते हैं स्टाफ मैनेजमेंट में, वो सब करते हैं। अच्छा, अब बात आती है मैम, जैसे सर ने सारा नॉलेज इसके बारे में दे दिया है, जो भी ऑडियंस होगी या हमें मैं ही ज्यादा गेन कर पाया उनसे, तो कि नेचुरल हैबिटेट के बारे में सब, लेकिन जो हम कंजर्वेशन ब्रीडिंग सेंटर में करते हैं, कंजर्वेशन ब्रीडिंग सेंटर हमारा सिर्फ हिमाचल प्रदेश में सिर्फ मनाली में ही कंजर्वेशन ब्रीडिंग सेंटर हिमालय मनाल का है, जो कि 2012 में एस्टेब्लिश हुआ था। इस ब्रीडिंग सेंटर में हेलो
जी
हेलो
सर, सुन पा रहे हैं।
हाँ जी, इस ब्रीडिंग सेंटर में हम छह एनक्लोजर बनाए गए थे। इन छह के छह एनक्लोजर में हम हिमालय मनाल की ब्रीडिंग करवाते हैं, और इसमें इन एनक्लोजर में नाइट शेड्स भी है, और ओपन एरिया भी रखा है, बायोलॉजिस्ट रूम, मॉनिटरिंग रूम में सीसीटीवी कैमरास लगे हैं, और जो इसकी फेंसिंग हुई है उसके आप अभी पिक्चर्स देख पाएंगे मैम। ये कंजर्वेशन ब्रीडिंग सेंटर है जो बिल्कुल ही फेंस्ड है हमारा इस तरह से, और एनक्लोजर के बीच में, एनक्लोजर के अंदर जो हमारी वेजिटेशन, जो हमने इनके नेचुरल हैबिटेट बनाने की कोशिश, बोल सकते हैं कि कोशिश की है, ये आप इस स्लाइड में देख सकते हैं जी। इसमें हमने डेंड्रोकैलम स्ट्रिक्टा, जो हिमालयन नरगाल के नाम से है, जो इनका हैबिटेट के लिए जरूरी होता है, इसके और भी जैसे जो श्रब टाइप है वो लगाया, बोल्डर्स है। फिर इनके जो हम नेस्टिंग करवाते हैं, वो जो हमारे एनिमल अटेंडेंट है उन्हीं से करवाते हैं नेस्टिंग भी। पेयरिंग हम तब करवाते हैं जब ये ब्रीडिंग सीजन के लिए तैयार रहते हैं, जब मेल फीमेल फीमेल चूज कर लेती है कि हमने मेटिंग करनी है किसी मेल से, तो जब जो अटेंडेंट और हमारे जो फ्रेश गार्ड है वो इंश्योर हो जाए कि ये पेयर अब पेयरिंग के लिए तैयार है, तो उनको हम कंजर्वेशन ब्रीडिंग सेंटर के एनक्लोजर में शिफ्ट कर देते हैं पेयरिंग के लिए। 2012 के बाद मैम सबसे पहले जो ब्रीडिंग हुई थी वो 2017 में हुई थी, हमारी सक्सेसफुल ब्रीडिंग बोल सकते थे, जिसमें कि एक पेयर ने 3 एग ले किए थे 22nd 23rd एंड 25th अप्रैल को। और एक पहली बार जो कैप्टिंग ब्रीडिंग हुई थी मोनाल की, उस दौरान एग लेइंग पहली बार हुई थी हिमाचल प्रदेश में। उसके बाद मैम इसके जो 27 दिनों तक इंक्यूबेशन पीरियड रहा, लेकिन जो इसका फीमेल ने एग ले किए थे वो अंडों पर बैठ नहीं रही थी, तो इसमें क्या किया हमने, बाहर से ब्रूडिंग हैन लाई और उससे इंक्यूबेशन के लिए रखा। फिर उससे जो चिक्स आए थे उसमें सिर्फ एक ही चिक सरवाइव हुआ था, जो 20 दिनों के बाद नहीं रहा था, सिर्फ 20 दिनों तक ही रहा था। फिर 2018 में फिर ब्रीडिंग के लिए फरवरी में हमने इनको शिफ्ट किया था कंजर्वेशन ब्रीडिंग सेंटर में, जिसमें कि 4 एग्स ले हुए थे, और उसमें 11 अप्रैल से 11 मई तक इंक्यूबेशन रहा इसका, और वो जो नेचुरल तरीके से हुआ था सारे, इसमें ब्रूडिंग हैन नहीं थे, जिसमें कि 4 चिक्स सरवाइव होते, लेकिन 2 चिक्स 25 मई 2018 को एक्सपायर, ये मर गए थे, सरवाइव नहीं कर पाए थे, और 2 चिक ही सरवाइव थे। और 2020 में जो फिर फरवरी मंथ में हमने पेयरिंग की, 2 पेयर्स की, और इसमें हम फिर सक्सेस रहे थे कि इसके हैचिंग हो पाए, एग लेइंग हो पाए, लेकिन अनफॉर्चुनेटली मंगूज अटैक से ये फिर मारे गए और फिर ब्रीडिंग सक्सेस नहीं हमारी। लेकिन 2021 में हमने सिर्फ एक पेड़ डाला और उसमें 3 एग लिए हुए थे, जो कि 12 अप्रैल से 3 अप्रैल तक हैचिंग अंडे दिए थे फीमेल ने, जिनका इंक्यूबेशन पीरियड 21 मई 2005 तक चला और 22 मई 2021 को 3 एग लिए हुए थे। और उन तीनों से तीनों जो चिक्स सरवाइव है हमारे पास आज 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 की डेट तक है। ये उनके फोटोग्राफ्स है मैम। और अभी अभी जैसे सर ने बताया कि इनकी अभी जुवेनाइल कंडीशन में इनका सेक्सुअली मैच्योर नहीं हो पाया है, अभी 1 साल के हुए हैं। उम्मीद करेंगे कि हम अक्टूबर नवंबर तक इसका पता लग जाएगा कि मेल है या फीमेल है। या सर ने बताया कि इनके जो फीमेल में जो व्हाइट पैच होगा वो फीमेल के रहेगा, तो कोशिश करेंगे कि इसको आइडेंटिफाई करें, या जब मैच्योर हो जाएंगे तो अपने आप पता लग जाएगा कि मेल है फीमेल है। जो हम कंजर्वेशन ब्रीडिंग सेंटर में जो हम प्रॉब्लम फेस कर रहे हैं, वो जो कंजर्वेशन ब्रीडिंग सेंटर है मनाली के बिल्कुल सेंटर टाउन में है, जिस वजह से कि वहाँ डिस्टरबेंस बहुत रहती है लोगों की, लेकिन फेंसिंग हमारी होने के बावजूद भी शोर रहता है। एक तो ये कारण है, दूसरा फीड एंड डाइट की थोड़ी दिक्कत रहती है। सर्दियों में हमें बर्फ 3-4 फुट पड़ जाता, तो जो ग्रीन लीव्स वगैरह जो इनके डाइटरी हैबिट है, अ, उसमें थोड़ी हल्की सी दिक्कत रहती है। फिर उसके बाद ओवर पॉपुलेशन रहता थोड़ा हमारा पेजेंट्री, क्योंकि ये सब रेस्क्यूड, ये इंजर्ड रहते हैं, तो इनको हम रिलीज भी नहीं कर पाते। तो उस दौरान जब ये ब्रीडिंग सीजन में आते हैं, तो जो आपसी जो इनमें लड़ाइयाँ होती है उस वजह से थोड़ा मोर्टेलिटी रहती है, फिर इनफर्टिलिटी रहती है कि या कोई फीमेल अपने अंडे खुद ही खा लेती है। ये दिक्कत रहती है मैम। ये 2018 में जब हिमालय मोनाल की ब्रीडिंग हुई थी उस वक्त का न्यूज में आया था, लेकिन इस बार हमने बिल्कुल ओपन नहीं किया इसको 2020 में जो हुआ, क्योंकि लोग बहुत आते हैं फिर देखने की कहाँ हुआ, तो थोड़ा डिस्टरबेंस रहता है। तो इसी वजह से जो अभी हमारे 3 सरवाइव कर रहे चिक्स बिल्कुल बिल्कुल हेल्दी है, और रूटीन चेकअप उनका एनुअल सॉरी मंथली भी कराते हैं कि अभी बिल्कुल ठीक रहे। और उम्मीद करेंगे कि अगली साल तक हम इनको ब्रीडिंग में बिल्कुल तैयार करेंगे। और एक ही थ्रेट्स में जैसे सर ने भी बताया कि थ्रेट्स जो मनाल मनाल के जो है तो लीस्ट कंसर्न है, लेकिन इसके जो डिक्रीज हुई पॉपुलेशन उसके पीछे यही है कि लॉस ऑफ हैबिटेट, जो उनका हैबिटेट डिस्ट्रक्शन हो रही है, वो किस वजह से कई कारण है। ओवर हंटिंग है, सर ने बताया जैसे कि टूरिज्म डिस्टर्बेंस है बहुत ज्यादा, जैसे मनाली किसी जगह में तो बहुत ज्यादा टूरिज्म है, ग्लोबल वार्मिंग है, टेरिस्टल हैबिटेट है, और कभी कभी ये फायर का भी रहता है हमारे, क्योंकि पहाड़ों में आग वगैरह लगती तो उससे मोर्टेलिटी रहती है। लेकिन ब्रीडिंग सीजन के दौरान आग तो नहीं लगती हमारी, लेकिन जब जो चिक्स रहते हैं तो फायर में उनके जलने और मरने का डर काफी रहता है। कंक्लूड करेंगे मैम। जो हमारा कंक्लूजन है, कंजर्वेशन प्रोटेक्शन ऑफ डिफरेंट थ्रेटेंड एंडेंजर्ड स्पीशीज। जैसा सर आपसे बहुत बात करना चाहूंगा, मैं भी आपसे कुछ सीखना चाहूंगा। मुझे अभी सिर्फ डेढ़ 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 साल ही हुए वाइल्ड लाइफ में आए हुए, अदरवाइज मेरी सारी पोस्टिंग टेरिटोरियल डिपार्टमेंट में रही है। तो
जरूर जरूर चमनलाल जी, डेफिनेटली।
जी सर जी। नेचुरल हैबिटेट के बारे में तो बहुत कुछ जानता था, क्योंकि हमारा सारा फॉरेस्ट से लेना देना रहता है। लेकिन जो कैप्टिव कंडीशन है, जैसे पेजेंट्री है, जूस है, इसमें कुछ मैं आपसे कुछ ज्ञान लेना चाहूंगा। दूसरा मैम,
जरूर।
हम सर अवेयरनेस प्रोग्राम्स भी चलाते हैं मोनाल की कंजर्वेशन के लिए मनाली में, क्योंकि कंजर्वेशन ब्रीडिंग है, तो लोगों को अवेयरनेस के लिए हमें अवेयरनेस और एजुकेशन प्रोग्राम चलाते हैं, जिसमें कि कॉम्पिटिशन्स है या कोई फील्ड विजिट करवाते हैं। जैसे हम स्कूल के बच्चों को ले गए थे, पेंटिंग कंपटीशन करा ले। ये हमारे डीएफओ साहब है जो क्वार्टरली एक तो हम अवेयरनेस कैंप लगाते ही है। क्वार्टरली एक डिवीजन लेवल का अवेयरनेस कैंप हमारा होता ही होता है सेंचुरीज के आसपास। जितने भी स्कूल्स है या टाउन में स्कूल है, उनका अवेयरनेस कैंप हम करते ही करते हैं, लोगों को अवेयर करने के लिए कि वाइल्ड लाइफ प्रोटेक्शन क्यों करनी है, उसका कंजर्व क्यों करना है। इसके बारे में हम डिसेमिनेट करते रहते हैं उनको, जो भी इंफॉर्मेशन होती है, लेटर इंफॉर्मेशन। बस सर इतना ही कहना चाहूंगा। थैंक यू। मैम
थैंक यू सो मच सर, आपने
थोड़ा
बहुत अच्छे से,
जल्दी बोल दिया मैंने।
कोई बात नहीं,
जी
आपने जू के बारे में बताया और आपके जो कैप्टिव
हाँ जी।
पॉपुलेशन जो आप कर रहे हैं अभी तक, आपने वो भी समझाया। थैंक यू सो मच फॉर दैट। अभी हम क्वेश्चन आंसर्स लेते हैं फॉर द सेशन। तो डॉक्टर सुरेश विल स्टार्ट विद योर द क्वेश्चन आंसर्स फॉर योर सेशन फर्स्ट. So the first question for
Yes,
you, sir,
please.
is that how does livestock grazing affect monals?
Okay, so basically, there are these migrant graziers who take their buffaloes or the sheep high up in the alpine pastures during the summer months. So, livestock grazing can impact in two forms. Once, trampling on the nests, okay, or the second, it's primarily that they are feeding on the vegetation, which are also very important for, I'm talking about the buffaloes or the sheep feeding on the above ground vegetation or the shoot or the leaves of the plants that the monals feed on, but the monals are feeding on the tubers. Now, if there is continuous repeated grazing in these areas, those plants will gradually die off. Those plants would not survive with that intense level of grazing. There is also this issue of which we have seen in other places in other landscapes, where wherever there is extensive livestock grazing, the habitat also becomes habitat gets degraded. It is replaced by species that are are not palatable even for the buffaloes. They start dominating. Okay. Now there is also issue of the ground getting compacted. Now some of these alpine plants needs this aeration in the soil. So it's very complex, it's very dynamic, but I'm telling it in a very simplistic manner that in areas where there is extensive grazing, all of these things would affect all of those plants that the Himalayan monal are dependent on.
Right, sir. And so the next question for you is that has there any intraspecific aggression been observed when during the breeding season?
Oh, yes. You might notice, the monals just do behave like our domestic chicken at home, and where they would jump up in the air and hit each other. Basically, they will use their tarsus, the legs, where there is a spur. Okay, there is a spur there. Now, they will try to hit each other with that spur. But what I have noticed, you don't see that very much, like in the in the red jungle fowl or a few other galliformis birds, like the blood pheasant, which is still higher up, but more to the eastern part, central and eastern parts of the Himalaya. They would have more number of spurs. Okay, so those species, there is more of combat happening between male and between two males, but here not much, but you do see that.
सर, जो कैप्टिव कैप्टिव कंडीशन में भी यही दिक्कत रहती है कि जब ब्रीडिंग सीजन के दौरान मेल्स में फाइट बहुत होती है, फीमेल भी
Yes.
अगर नंबर्स में ज्यादा तो वो भी आपस में फाइटिंग चली रहती है उनकी, तो इस वजह से कैप्टिव कंडीशन में मोर्टेलिटी काफी रहती है हमारी।
राइट जरूर।
हाँ जी।
क्योंकि जब आप
नेचुरल में
कैप्टिव
उतना शायद नहीं भी हो।
यस, जब जो आप कैप्टिव एनवायरनमेंट में लेके आ जाते हैं ना, तो
जी
स्पेस, फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल स्पेस कंस्ट्रेंट, और
जी
मोनाल में क्या है, ज्यादा विजुअल सिग्नलिंग चल रहा है उनके बीच में।
हाँ जी
ओके,
जी
तो पहले वो फेदर को ही डिस्प्ले करके दिखाएंगे
सर।
कि मैं कितना स्ट्रांग हूँ। वो एक्चुअली कॉम्बैट उतना कम करेंगे वाइल्ड में। तो वो विजुअल
कैप्टिव में
कम्युनिकेशन
ज्यादा
से
रहेगा।
आपको पता चल जाएगा इवन इन कैप्टिव कंडीशंस विच इंडिविजुअल इज वेरी एग्रेसिव और मोर डोमिनेंट। जो
जी
सब डोमिनेंट इंडिविजुअल अडल्ट प्लूमेज दिखेगा आपको, बट वो वीक रहेगा, उसको निकालना पड़ेगा। सो दीज आर प्रॉब्लम्स दैट यू विल फेस इन कैप्टिव सिचुएशन।
Right, so the next question for you is that can we conclude that the Himalayan Monal is a habitat and diet specialist? And what do you think should be the variables or factors that should be considered while taking up conservation breeding of this species?
Oh, yes, of course. This is definitely a diet specialist, I would say. Though, in many touristy places, whether you're talking about Bhutan or Nepal or even here in Western Himalayas and Uttarakhand, people have started provisioning food to them. They started offering rice and grains and wheat and whatnot. So the monals have started to actually feed on that. and in Sagarmatha National Park in Nepal, they regularly come down during winter and dig up potato fields and feed on the potatoes. So they're tuber feeders. So they do feed on that, but still in the wilderness, they are specialists. They're tuber feeders. They depend on select few plants. Now coming to the question of and of course, they are habitat specialists. They are truly alpine associated or temperate forest, not even temperate forest. They are actually in the tree line zone, what we call as the crumb holes, technically called the crumb holes or the tree line. That is the habitat where the Himalayan monal require. They basically depend, need open spaces. They need to see their predators much in advance. So they need open spaces. So that's the kind of habitat that they occur in. Now, like all other species that we do try to breed or are part of the conservation breeding programs, diet is foremost. Okay, so of course many zoos do ensure that they get the right kind of food, and so they're usually pumped up with lot of nutritious food. There is very high hormonal buildup, and that would result in all sorts of other aggressions. So we need to arrive at a very a balanced plan of how we want to manage. It's not that every year you should breed the same males. It's okay if in a particular year you're resting some males, but certain years you breed some males. So you need to have those kind of planning that needs to go in. Just to share with you, this is one of the very popularly kept pheasants in the US and in Europe. There people breed them quite extensively. They easily breed in captivity there, and they trade in them. There's a lot of money that goes into this. And there are some areas where the Himalayan monal have been introduced, for example, like in some parts of California in the US, where they have kind of naturalized small populations of these birds do survive in the wild. So to basically say that in captive conditions, you need to really look into several other factors than just food alone.
Right, sir. And so the next question for you is: do you think in-situ conservation is meaningful for the species, considering how the species is doing in wild?
Okay, so I wouldn't. I mean, this is a very personal opinion of mine. There are some of these species would not really need conservation breeding at this point of time, and unless of course you are very clear that there is this population that you need to supplement. Okay, in the wild in a particular area, the Himalayan Himalayan monal population has dropped drastically, and you will need to reintroduce there. You can possibly wait for, you basically remove those threats that have led to the decline and wait for the populations to come back. They would, but there may be situations where they may not. So looking at that point of view, you might actually plan on conservation breeding. But I would rather say that at this point of time, given our knowledge, I would say that focusing more on maintaining captive stocks in zoos is something that what I would suggest, not actually truly for conservation breeding. Use this species for creating awareness. It's fantastic. It's a fantastic species for display. People get attracted to the Himalayan monal. They would like to come and see it. So at this point of time, I would say not really necessary, not really a priority species for conservation breeding. But if some zoos are practicing it, then it's good because you get to learn quite a bit of things about breeding this particular species. They are basically quite finicky. They're not like our chickens that you just put them together and they breed. You might have heard of the story of the Western Tragopan. In fact, almost all of the pheasants, we are not seeing great successes. Of course, outside of India, they are seeing a lot of success. But in our zoos, the main problem is that there's a lot of sexual selection at play. The females are choosing to mate with those males. Now, if you try to put them together, forced to mate, then what happens is that very likely that the females are rejecting the sperms. Okay, I'm not really very sure. I'm suspecting this is happening. That is why very often when they do lay the eggs, they're not fertile, and we think that the mating didn't go well. The mating may have gone well, but she would have rejected the sperms. So there is possibly a lot of sexual selection, the females selecting from males, that is happening in the wild, which we are not able to recreate in the captive situation.
Captive condition.
Right, sir. And so the last question for you is that what are the conservation interventions required for the in-situ conservation of the species? I think you've already elaborated on it during the question answers, but if you could just
Yes, so the
state it
focus
again.
should be more on identifying critical hotspots. See, we do have a good understanding that Himalayan Monal is there everywhere, all over. And we are also accepting with the fact that the more the remoter the Himalayan populations are doing well. But I would definitely suggest that we need to identify, as a researcher, as a biologist, this should be one of the activities that we need to highlight, which are those areas where there are good populations of Himalayan Monal, which we don't have.
Right, sir. So those were the questions for you. We now move on to questions for the zoo. So, Mr. Chaman, आपके लिए first question है कि कंजर्वेशन अवेयरनेस एक्टिविटी जैसे आपने बताया है कि की जाती है, तो कुछ स्पेसिफिक एक्टिविटीज की जाती हैं स्पीशीज को लेके या जनरली वाइल्ड लाइफ के ऊपर की जाती हैं?
नहीं, जनरली ज्यादातर हमारा जो वाइल्ड लाइफ कंजर्वेशन के लिए रहती है जनरल, लेकिन स्पेसिफिक हम साल में एक बार जरूर करते हैं हिमालयन मोनाल को लेकर कि उसके कंजर्वेशन को लेकर अवेयरनेस, जो भी नई रिसर्च है कहीं और से लेके, या हम क्या कर रहे हैं हर साल एक बार जरूर अवेयरनेस स्पेसिफिक हिमालयन मोनाल के लिए जरूर कराते हैं। अदरवाइज जो 3-4 हमारा जो अवेयरनेस कैंप्स वगैरह होते हैं वो जनरल वाइल्ड लाइफ के लिए।
ठीक है सर। और आपके लिए जो दूसरा क्वेश्चन है वो ये है कि कोई स्पेशल मैनेजमेंट प्रैक्टिस जो आपका जू अडॉप्ट करता है सर्दियों के लिए, मतलब मैनेजमेंट ऑफ द जू और स्पीशीज के लिए आप क्या कुछ
सर्दियों के लिए स्पेसिफिक मैनेजमेंट हमारी मैम यही रहती है कि बर्फ की वजह से जो हमारे फीजेंट्स है उनका डाइट को कोई नुकसान नहीं होना चाहिए। जो भी डाइट चार्ट वेटरिनरियन हमें फॉलो करने को बोलते हैं वो थोड़ा सा उसमें दिक्कत रहती है, लेकिन दिक्कत हार्डली 1 या 2 दिन। दूसरे दिन को अगर ट्रैफिक नहीं भी खुलता तो हमारे पास जो फिजेंट्री में जो वर्कर है उसके अलावा हम हायर करके जब मैनुअली उनके लिए जो ग्रीन लीव्स अरेंज करते हैं, फ्रूट्स अरेंज करते हैं। मनाली में कई बार 3-4 दिन ट्रैफिक नहीं रहता है, कुल्लू से मनाली की तरफ को मार्केट थोड़ा स्लो रहती है फिर बर्फ में, तो थोड़ी सी दिक्कत रहती है, लेकिन हम मैनेज कर लेते हैं सारा। मैनुअली करना पड़ता है, करना पड़ेगा, फिजेंट्स को वैसे छोड़ नहीं सकते हैं। जो डाइट चार्ट है उसको फॉलो बिल्कुल करते हैं।
ठीक है सर। तो यही क्वेश्चंस थे आपके लिए। सो विद दिस वी कम टू एन एंड फॉर आवर 57th Know Your Species, Know Your Zoo Talk. On behalf of CZA, I would like to thank both Dr. Suresh and to you, Mr. Chaman, for taking time out of your schedules and joining us for this talk. And I would also like to thank the audience who've been with us throughout and, must have gained quite a bit of knowledge on the Himalayan Monal and what is happening in terms of Nehru Pheasantry. We will be back next week on Wednesday with our week 58 species, which is the Himalayan black bear, and zoo, which is the Renuke mini zoo. So do tune in for that talk next Wednesday from 4 to 5 p.m. And we come to a conclusion for this talk. So namaskar.
नमस्कार,
Thank you, sir.
थैंक यू सो मच।
Thank you.
चमन लाल जी, हम मिलेंगे।
जी सर, मैं
हाँ,
आपका नंबर लेना चाहूंगा सर।
ओके, मेरा नंबर ले लीजिए।
जी
9359
9359
433
433
837।
837। मैं कॉल करूंगा सर आपको।
आप मुझे व्हाट्सअप कर दीजिए इस नंबर पे।
जी
ओके, व्हाट्सअप है इस नंबर पे, तो आप व्हाट्सअप कर
जी
सकते
सर। जी
हैं।
थैंक यू सर।
चलिए,
आपकी
अच्छा लगा आपसे
गाइडलाइन की
भी,
जरूरत रहेगी
आपको
सर
भी।
आगे भी बहुत हमें। ठीक है सर,
हाँ,
थैंक यू सर।
थैंक यू, बाय।